Welcome to Spirit Matters, where we explore matters of the spirit with leading experts from across the spiritual spectrum, all designed to enrich and enlarge your wisdom, deepen your joy and peace, and awaken your inner connection to the divine. Here's your host, Philip Goldberg.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you for tuning into Spirit Matters. If you're wondering about the new platform and you're used to the podcast I co-hosted with Dennis Ramundi for several years, you should know that that iteration of Spirit Matters ended, but you can take advantage of the archive if you go to spiritmatterstalk.com or the YouTube channel of the same name. You'll find about 300 interviews with exceptional spiritual teachers and experts of different kinds. So I invite you to go there. It's free. But this is the new version here on mindbodyspirit.fm. And we are continuing the tradition of interviews and conversations with a diverse range of wise people who will help you along your own spiritual path. And I'm very pleased that today's guest is another wise person, Swami Sarvapriyananda. He's been the minister and spiritual leader of the Vedanta Society of New York since 2017. Prior to that, he served in various capacities at the headquarters of the Ramakrishna Mission in India, outside of Kolkata, and as the assistant minister of the Vedanta Society of Southern California in Los Angeles. And for those who don't know, the Vedanta Society here and the Ramakrishna Mission in India are organizations founded by Swami Vivekananda in the 1890s. And that those lineages continue quite actively in both India and the West. In recent years, Swami Sarvapriyananda has become a widely known and highly regarded public speaker at a variety of platforms and has played a prominent role in various interfaith activities, including the World Parliament of Religions and the United Nations. If you enter his name on YouTube, you'll get a great education on Vedanta and Indian philosophy and all other subjects related to spiritual development and new ideas perhaps for you. Swami, welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Phil, for having me in Spirit Matters.
If I may start with a personal question, I hope you don't mind. You joined the Ramakrishna Mission in 1994 and received sannyas, meaning you took monastic vows in 2004. When did you discern as a young man that this was your calling, that this was your dharma, so to speak? And was it a difficult choice in any way?
Well, I think it goes back to my childhood. I've had occasion to ask monks later on when they decided to become a monk, and exactly the same question you're asking me. And I always get two kinds of answers. One is that they were in their teens, maybe, or a little later in their 20s, and having completed their education, maybe they were working or just finishing their studies, and maybe they read a book or they came across some inspiring teacher or monk, and suddenly they decided, or something happened in their life, and suddenly they decided to become a monk. That's one kind, and that's maybe more are in that category. But there's also the other kind who always felt a pull, a spiritual pull since their childhood. And I think I belong to that category because as far back as I can remember, even when I was, in grade school, I always used to think that at first my aim was I wanted to become a pilot and fly aeroplanes like every little boy. But there would always be the second option would be find God, the goals of life, fly airplanes, and number two would be find God. And as I grew older, the priorities shifted. So the search for God. I think it comes from the milieu where I grew up. My parents were devotees in the Ramakrishna mission and they used to go to the local ashram. And there were books of Vivekananda lying around in the house. And I was a bookworm. And this was way before internet, even the cable TV or whatever. So we had to entertain ourselves with books. And when I read Vivekananda, where he says straight away, the goal of human life is God realization. It is possible to experience God, and that's the purpose of human life. You transcend all suffering. You get what you want actually when you get God. It all resonated very deeply with me. And I thought, if this is true, then why do anything else? And this I thought long before I knew the details of monastic life. As I found out more about the ashram, about the monks. And somewhere along the line, I think by the time I was in college, I had firmly made up my mind that I was going to seek God and be a monk, seek God by being a monk. So when I finished my education, that was it. I had already long ago made up my mind. It was not very difficult. I have somehow been blessed. There are those who go through a deep struggle, which is very understandable because it's a huge shift in life. But maybe because this train of thought had started in me when I was very young, I never had any serious conflict ever. So I always knew that finding God is the goal, the purpose of my life, and being a monk is the best way to do it. And I was also blessed that there were no obstacles. It was a fairly easy process for me to step away from everything and slide into a monastery and become a monk.
No objections from your family?
Oh, huge objections, enormous objections, lots and lots of drama. But that's what you see in almost every family. There's a very few fortunate, young men and women whose families, especially in India, which are where people are very child-centric. So my parents were devotees and they revered monks, but not my son.
Right.
Let somebody else's son become a monk. But they veered around eventually. And so,
I wrote a biography of Swami Vivekananda's illustrious person who followed in his footsteps, Yogananda, and he had, it was very amusing reading about and writing, the obstacles he faced, because he too knew he was headed in that direction as a child, really, and the family, they arranged marriages for him on 3 different occasions. Well, thank you for that. I know our listeners are usually curious about how people find their calling in that way. And most of our listeners are probably familiar with what Vedanta is. But for those who are not, how would you describe the essence of what Vedanta philosophy is, if you had to sort of sum it up in core principle?
Well, straight away, I would use Vivekananda's words. Vedanta is the divinity within us, our own divine nature, and the oneness of all existence. Now, Vedanta, the word literally means the end of the Vedas, or the final or the highest teachings of the Vedas. The Vedas being the foundational scriptures, the most ancient scriptures of the Hindus, probably the most ancient existing spiritual literature in the world. In these Vedas, you find texts called the Upanishads, which contain spiritual and philosophical teachings, mystical teachings also. And these teachings form the basis of Vedanta. So literally, Vedanta, the textual part of Vedanta would be the Upanishads and the enormous amount of literature, commentarial literature, which has grown up around the Upanishads. So one book that is most popularly associated with Hinduism is the Bhagavad Gita. But the Bhagavad Gita is in itself a kind of commentary and exposition of the Upanishads. In fact, Krishna openly quotes mantras, verses from the Upanishads on different occasions in the Bhagavad Gita. So the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and another text called the Brahma Sutras. These form the triple basis of Vedanta. And then there's multiple layers of commentary, multiple schools which have grown up over thousands of years. The particular school which is very well known and which I belong to is called Advaita Vedanta, which is the school started by, or whose commentarial basis was laid by Adi Shankaracharya about 1400 years ago. Here, the idea is that our real nature, who we really are not these creatures of flesh and blood, not mortal creatures which are born and fated to die in a few years, but we are spiritual. We are spirits. We are existence, consciousness, bliss in Vedantic terms, Sat, Chit, Ananda. And the goal is to realize that. Once you realize that, the fulfillment of human life is attained. That's the kernel of Vedanta. Again, to sum up in Vivekananda's words, the divinity within us and the oneness of all existence.
Now, you alluded to this. Most people are familiar, if they are familiar with Vedanta, it's usually Advaita Vedanta, and they don't realize that there's other schools of Vedanta, especially, and that one of them is a dualistic one. And how do you explain those different schools and how they relate to one another? In India, is there, among all the various lineages and everything, is there contentiousness about the different interpretations of Vedanta? Or are they simply understood as perhaps three different ways of perceiving and describing the same reality?
Right. It's true that Advaita Vedanta is sort of prominent, prominent, I think, more in the intellectual space, the mind space of people looking at Indian spirituality, rather than on the ground. So in India, on the ground, most people would tend to be devotional.
Yes.
Very few would speak about the impersonal, pure being, pure consciousness, pure bliss. Most people would speak about Rama and Krishna. And today, by the way, is auspicious. Today is Ram Navami, the birthday of Sri Ramchandra.
Just for listeners who, because this is not live, it is March 30th, 2023.
Right. So most people would be devotional. They would be devotees of Rama or Krishna or God in one of the various forms worshipped in Hinduism as Vishnu, Narayana, Shiva, or the Divine Mother, Shakti, and so on. Why this happened was, I think, partly because in the late 19th century, early 19th century, late 19th century, when Europeans, the British, the Germans, and later on the Americans, like Emerson and Thoreau and all, when they began to discover Indian thought, they sort of naturally took to Advaita Vedanta, which is probably for very good reasons, because it's the philosophically most appealing to the modern man, which is one of the reasons why Swami Vivekananda stressed it in his teachings here in the West. That's another very big reason, because Swami Vivekananda also gave a lot of stress on Advaita Vedanta, the Advaitic non-dual interpretation of the Upanishads. So, and of course, our home tradition in our order, the Ramakrishna order and the Vedanta Society, is Advaita Vedanta. What I teach is classical Advaita Vedanta, but inflected with the sort of more liberal understanding given to us by Ramakrishna Vivekananda. However, there are multiple schools of Vedanta. So just to run you through, you mentioned three. So often that's how it's presented, that there is Advaita, the non-dual interpretation of Vedanta. There is Vishishta Advaita with the qualified monastic interpretation of Vedanta. And then there's Dvaita Vedanta, the dualistic interpretation. But there are many more. So there is the Shuddha Dvaita, there is the Dvaita Advaita, there is the Achintya Bheda Bheda, which is, though it sounds esoteric, it's actually pretty common here in the United States. That is the philosophy of the the Hare Krishnas, the International Society of Krishna Consciousness. That's another school of Vedanta. So all of these are philosophies evolved from a set of texts. The Upanishads, the Brahma Sutras, the Bhagavad Gita. Also, in addition, for the more dualistic texts, an important text would be the Bhagavata Purana, which deals with the incarnations of Vishnu, especially of Sri Krishna. Philosophically, the central distinction would be this. The traditional triad of sentient beings like us and all living beings, animals and plants, that's one vertex of the triangle. The other vertex would be the world, the material world which we inhabit, the non-living world. And the third vertex of the triangle would be a god, the god of religion, the god of a theistic religion, who is the creator, preserver, destroyer, who is omniscient, omnipotent, all-loving, good. So this is the traditional triangle in which religion operates, theistic religion operates. Now, the dualistic approach to Vedanta would say, the dualistic schools would say, this is it. We are all separate sentient beings inhabiting a world of difference, a material world separate from us, which we inhabit. And there is a God who is separate from this, who is an independent, who is the only independent reality. So God, sentient beings, insentient matter are separate realities, and God is the supreme being controlling all of it. Very standard, basic dualistic religion, theistic religion. The other interpretation would be the qualified monastic or Vishishtadvaita, where it says, no, they are not separate. Actually, there's an organic unity. God is the one reality whose qualifications, adjuncts, or adjectives, you can say. Literally, it means adjectives. Vishishta means adjectival. Sentient beings and the material universe are parts of God. So there is a divine unity of the universe. The entire universe is one divine reality, which is God. And we and the material world which we see around us, they are all parts of this divine reality. They're not separate from each other. So, but as parts, we are separate. It's like a human body, for example. Hands are separate from the feet, and which is separate from the head or the tummy. But we are all one organic body. So the universe constitutes the body of God, so to say. Now comes non-dual Vedanta, which denies this internal difference also. So there is no external difference. There's nothing apart from God. But within God also, there is no difference. There is only one homogeneous existence consciousness place. And then in that case, the entire world of difference which we see around us, chairs and tables, quarks and quasars, human beings and dogs and cats, all of these are mere appearance. At their root, at their base, is one homogeneous, undivided, undifferentiated existence consciousness place, this pure being, which you are. This is the central teaching of Advaita Vedanta, Tat Tvamasi, you are that, and the goal is to realize that. So these are different varieties of Vedanta. And often when you look at Hinduism, you go to, say, Hindu temple and you see the bewildering array of rituals and colorful imagery, behind it is usually some school of Vedanta or an allied school, like Tantra or some such school is there. So Vedanta I would say the various schools of Vedanta constitute the philosophy of Hinduism at large.
Thank you. I have a linguistic question for you because you mentioned Vishishta Advaita. I was just in India, and one of the things we did was visit the cave outside of Rishikesh that was said to be where the great ancient sage Vashishta lived. And when I first heard the term Vishishta Advaita, I thought, oh, it must have something to do with him. But I'm not so sure.
No. So Vashishta is just the name of the sage, and Vishishta just means it comes from the Sanskrit term Visheshana, which means adjective. So like a blue flower. So the blue is the adjective for flower. It's what kind of flower is the blue flower. So what kind of God? It's a God qualified by sentient beings and an insentient universe. So we are this is how they split it up in Sanskrit. Jiva Jagat Vishishta Brahma. Brahman qualified by Jiva, sentient beings, Jagat, material universe. So, yeah, they don't want to erase the difference, which is so obvious to all of us, and say, it's different. But so, your hands and feet are different too, but that doesn't mean they're not part of a unity. So we are all part of a divine unity with internal difference.
Got it. You mentioned the three textual sources of Vedanta. One of them being the Bhagavad Gita, which is, of all the text emanating from India, would be the one most Americans are familiar with. Recently, I have two questions, but first, the first Gita I ever read, which had a big impact on me back a long time ago, was the one coming from your lineage, from the Vedanta Press in California, translated by Swami Prabhavananda, one of your illustrious predecessors, and the great novelist Christopher Isherwood. And it was singularly interesting because, or compelling, because you had the insight and wisdom of Swami Prabhavananda and the skillful English prose of Christopher Isherwood. But it's always been very frustrating to me because they wrote it in literary form without numbering the verses. And so you couldn't look things up easily. Now there's a new version, and I just wanted to let listeners know about this new version that was painstakingly edited so that the text remains the same, but the verses are identified. Well, I don't know if I have a question for you, but I just wanted to announce that and tell, that was an undertaking of your lineage, and I know it was rather painstaking. I'm sure you welcome it, and
that's true. I think it's just become more, a beautiful book has just become more useful now. So it was a very fruitful collaboration between Christopher Isherwood and Swami Prabhavanandaji, who was who was the founder of the Vedanta Society of Southern California. So it's very poetic, language is very luminous and gets the spirit of the message across. And now they have been very careful to preserve the original work of Prabhavanandaji and Christopher Isherwood. The language is so beautiful. They just carefully inserted the verse numbers so that one can refer it back to the original verses. It just makes it more useful and grounded in the original text.
And I welcome it. It's a great addition to our understanding. Speaking of the literature, fewer people are familiar with the Upanishads, and very few are familiar with the Brahma Sutras. But if people wanted to delve into the Upanishads, there are many, many Upanishads. Where would you advise people to go as a good starting point? What are the more accessible Upanishads?
I would say the best way to start with the Upanishads is to start with the Bhagavad Gita first. Take a look at the Bhagavad Gita first, because the Bhagavad Gita is basically an exposition of the philosophy of the Upanishads by Krishna to Arjuna in a practical form, in a concise and practical form. The question would be at the end of the Upanishad, so this is great, what do I do with it? And Krishna tells you what you do with it. He's talking to Arjuna, who is very much a man of the world. He's a warrior in the midst of a great crisis. So in the midst of the various crises of our life, how is Vedanta going to be useful to us? Vivekananda used to say Vedanta started off by being practical first and the philosophy next. So now, when you go back to the sources, even the source for Krishna is the Upanishads. Multiple Upanishads are there. There is an authoritative list of 108. There were more than that, but 108, you find a list in a Upanishad called Muktika Upanishad. You find there's a list of 108 Upanishads, but more practically and more relevant would be 10 Upanishads, mainly because Shankaracharya, about 1400 years ago, he chose those 10 out of this vast body of literature to write commentaries and explain them. So we have a nice little Sanskrit verse which gives you the list of the 10 Upanishads to be studied. It goes like this. Ishakena katha prashna mundamandukya titirihi aitareyam cha chandogyam brihad aranyakam tatha. So Isha Upanishad, Kena Upanishad, Katha Upanishad, Prashna Upanishad, Mundaka Upanishad, Mandukya Upanishad, Aitariya Upanishad, Taittiriya Upanishad, Chandogya, and Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. So these are the 10 major Upanishads. Major only because Shankaracharya wrote commentaries on that, and that's why we today call them major Upanishads. But there is also a whole range of other Upanishads.
Yeah.
Among those Upanishads, they're all famous for different reasons. I would say for ease of reading and of, inspiring, simple, straightforward, powerful, poetic, Katha Upanishad beats all the others. So the Katha Upanishad.
Katha, for listeners, is spelled Katha.
Right, Katha Upanishad. So there you find, like most of the Upanishads, they are in the form of dialogues between teacher and student. So in Katha Upanishad, there's a very nice story to begin with of the little boy Nachiketa, who goes to the house of death and asks him about the mystery of death. What really happens after death? Is there something that survives death? And the whole point is, what's our real nature then? Are we bodies that are born and they die, or are we this immortal soul? And what's the nature of that soul? And how do you come to know that? And how knowing that will set you free from suffering and give you fulfillment. So that's the Katha Upanishad, the dialogue between Yama, the lord of death, and the little boy Nachiketa.
Very good. Thank you for that. Let me ask you something that I've noticed perplexes or confuses people sometimes, and that's the relationship between Vedanta, also of yoga, and what we call in Hinduism, as a religious category. I often say, Swami Vivekananda did not start the Hindu society, he started the Vedanta society, and he probably did that for good reasons. One of the interesting things about the integration of the teachings from India into the West, and America in particular, is you find that people who take up Buddhist practices like Vipassana meditation, or study with a Roshi or a Lama or a Rinpoche, or who go on Buddhist retreats and so forth, often don't hesitate to call themselves Buddhists. But there are millions of people like me whose primary spiritual orientation, if you look at how they think about their spirituality and what their practices are essentially Hindu. Often more Hindu than people born into Hinduism, because they meditate regularly, they do yogasanas, they go to kirtan and all that, celebrate Shivaratri or whatever, but they don't call themselves Hindu. Why is that? Is there something about the perception of what we call Hinduism?
Yes, that's a good question. Well, first off, straight off, the name Hinduism, it's not a name that was given to Hindus by Hindus. We did not choose to call ourselves Hindus. The story goes at least that the Persians couldn't pronounce the name of the river Sindhu, which demarcated India from, the northern part of Afghanistan. And so um, it, what is now in Pakistan, actually. So the Persians pronounced it Hindu. And so all the people living on the eastern bank of the river Sindhu became Hindus, whoever lived there. And then the general term for the religious practices of the people who lived there became Hinduism. And we Hindus are happy with it also, the name. We have no quarrel with it. If you want to be more particular, finicky about it, when Hindus would, we would call ourselves either Sanatana Dharma, the eternal religion, or Vedantists. Vivekananda said that Vedantists would be a more accurate term. Here, Vedanta, in a very broad sense, as the philosophy of Hinduism. So,
or yogis. People would call themselves yogis.
Yes, and that's perfectly all right. The word yoga is an allied term. In this broadest sense, it means a path of spiritual practice. So all paths of spiritual practice, in one sense, are yogas. For example, in the Bhagavad Gita, there are 18 chapters, and each chapter is called a yoga. Swami Vivekananda famously, he classified all paths of spiritual practice under 4 yogas: the yoga of devotion to God, the bhakti yoga, the yoga of spiritual inquiry, philosophical inquiry into the self, that is jnana yoga, path of knowledge. Then the yoga of selfless service, karma yoga. The yoga of meditation, dhyana yoga, raja yoga. He called it raja yoga. So these broadly 4 yogas. And if you look at a wide variety of practices in devotion, in meditation, but they can all be generally classified under these 4. So yoga is a path of spiritual practice. Yoga is also one of the schools of philosophy, of orthodox Hindu philosophy. So like Vedanta is a school of Hindu philosophy, which is predominant, and which has many sub-schools, as we talked about. But yoga, Patanjali was the rishi who wrote the Yoga Sutras, the way of meditation which will take you to enlightenment and freedom. So in a technical sense, yoga refers to the school of philosophy of Patanjali. So yoga's philosophy. Literally, the word yoga has 2 meanings. One is the Sanskrit derivation of yujir yoga, to join 2 things together. So, for example, joining the sentient beings with God, jivatma with paramatma, that is yoga. All spiritual paths do that. The second derivation would be yuj samadho, which means meditation. Yoga, the root meaning, etymological meaning of yoga is also meditation. So to call meditation yoga is perfectly all right. It's very precise. Now, what has also happened is that one of the streams of yoga was hatha yoga, which was body-centric, meant to develop the body in a harmonious way. One main benefit being good health. But the purpose was always to be ready for meditation and to realize God, or to become enlightened. That was the original purpose of Hatha Yoga. Over the last few decades, Hatha Yoga has become very popular across the world. Now we have an International Day of Yoga, but by stressing just 2 aspects of Hatha Yoga, which is the asanas, the physical postures, and to some extent the breathing exercises, the pranayama, which are of course of immense value for health. But they are just like a couple of components which have been picked out of the whole system of Hatha Yoga. The all purposes of all these yogas was enlightenment or God realization. So that's yoga for you, that's Vedanta, and that's Hinduism. Now, why would large number of people have Hindu practices? You're absolutely right. I think one reason would be that Hinduism has, unlike Buddhism, Hinduism has never been a missionary religion, has never been a converting religion. I think until Vivekananda, Hinduism remained for large part, for centuries, if not millennia, confined within the subcontinent of India. It was more of an ethnic set of religious practices. There were, in ancient times, we are getting more and more records of Hinduism spreading out to Southeast Asia. There have been huge Hindu temples, ruins found in Cambodia, for example, Hindu influences in China, on the Shinto religion of Japan. So there's a lot that we don't know really. And interactions between Hindu philosophers and the Greek philosophers So there's a lot that we really don't know, but there are interesting little clues all around that Hinduism was more of a global phenomenon at one time, thousands of years back. But now, certainly due to Vivekananda and all the teachers who followed him to America, Yogananda Paramahamsa being an illustrious successor in that line of teachers. So now again, it's a worldwide phenomenon. But the way it has come is not as a converting religion, but as a set of practices and ideas and ideals, which I think is very attractive to the modern 20th and 21st century mentality. So that's why you see a widespread influence, a kind of hidden influence of Hinduism throughout American and Western culture and the global culture now, in forms of yoga practices, meditation practices. I would say, somebody called Buddhism, then the extraordinary popularity of Buddhism, somebody called Buddhism export quality Hinduism. It was designed for export, but basically the ideas are all from the subcontinent. So that's why you see a spread of Hindu ideas, Hindu practices for people who would call themselves Christians, maybe Jews, maybe, or atheists, or spiritual but not religious, or
Right.
kind of New Age spirituality. So this is very common. I think Hindus are fine with it. There's a newfound concern about appropriation of Hindu ideas and practices, which is all very good. It should be recognized. The sources, where has yoga come from? Where has Ayurveda come from? Where indeed a lot of practices which are now secularized, like mindfulness, which comes from Buddhism, and you can trace it back from Buddhism back to the Buddha's own yoga teachers who were would be called Hindu.
Yes, we forget that Buddha himself was born a Hindu and was quite an accomplished yogi.
Yes, absolutely. He himself talks about the teachers with whom he was not completely satisfied. That's why he struck out on his own. But definitely, he learned a lot from them. And if you look at what he seemed to have learned from them, you would see it was a kind of Patanjali yoga. It was a kind of Sankhya philosophy, which he learned from his teachers. He had studied the existing teachings very deeply at that time.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Speaking of which, you've been very active in interfaith activities. It used to be many years ago that an interfaith gathering was essentially a priest, a minister, and a rabbi, and like the setup of a joke with a punchline. And frankly, I used to go to them, and I was often very bored. Now they're much more diverse because of immigration and just growing awareness. How have you seen interfaith activities change? I know there's in August, there's a Parliament of World Religions coming again, another iteration of the famous Parliament of 1893, which we remember primarily because it's where Swami Vivekananda stole the show, so to speak. And there's one coming up. And in my experience, they've grown more diverse. How have you seen the interfaith activities change? And what do you see? Why are they of value?
Right. Straight off, let me answer the last one first. Why are they of value? I think they're of immense value. One of the possible criticisms which I hear in the interfaith meetings themselves, various kinds of interfaith meetings, is that, well, you're preaching to the choir. Everybody who's participating in interfaith is basically moderate, liberal, open to other faiths, and friendly, which is fine. I think there is a value to that. And the criticism is that, what about those people who are fanatical or fundamentalist who say that my way or the highway? They are not hearing this message. They are not even interested in participating in such meetings. It's true, but it's also good for the choir to meet some once in a while. It's good for people who have goodwill. It's good for people who strongly believe in interfaith harmony and peace to get together and reiterate that message and send it out strongly once in a while. And that has its deep value. It's very important for leaders of different religions to meet with each other. It creates trust. It creates a personal connect between the leaders. And so when they go back to their congregations and communities, they retain these connections. It's um, it's much it's much more difficult to be hostile to somebody you are personally friendly with on theological grounds. If it's very difficult to fight with that, you can have disagreements and friendly debates. So there is a great value to interfaith. Earlier, you had asked me a question which I didn't reply to. What about these various strands of Hinduism? Are they contentious? Do they have problems within? So if you see the answer would be yes and no. If you see the 3,000-4,000 years of development of religion in India, in Indian history, you find one kind of contentiousness which I'll come to. But what is most observable when you look at it from the perspective of world history is that the next to nothing, when it comes to bloodshed and warfare, organized violence in the name of religion, there have been little fights here and there, but little, I would say, compared to what has happened in the West and especially in the Middle East, and continues to happen. So that is something very remarkable, which has not yet been significantly explored. Vivekananda and Hindu leaders throughout the last century have believed this is one of the things that Hinduism can bring to the table in interfaith conferences. Interfaith is not just a matter of theology and communal peace. It's a matter of national security, international security now. So there has been almost no violence, theological violence, in that there have been fights, but not on the basis of my religion is right, so I'm going to wipe you out or convert you or wipe you out. That did not happen until the late advent of Islamic forces, and then later from when the European colonizers came to India. Notice that Christianity had come nearly 2,000 years ago. The story goes that the Apostle Thomas, doubting Thomas, he came to India just after the lifetime of Jesus Christ. And so from that time onwards, there has been a continuous Christian community in India with no problems at all, until the coming of the European colonizers, who decided that these are heretics, or these are polytheists and unbelievers, and we have to convert them. Or the Islamic invaders. Interestingly, Islam had come to India before the invaders, almost during the lifetime of the Prophet himself. There were traders coming from the Arabian Peninsula to the south of India, and in fact, one of the oldest mosques in the world is probably the second or third oldest mosque in the world, was constructed in Kerala, and I believe it continues to exist. Judaism has been there in India for nearly 2,000 years after the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans. Zoroastrianism, the majority community of Zoroastrians is actually the bulk of them who still exists, a tiny community, but many of them, they live in India. They're known as the Parsis, or the Persians in the Parsis. So there has been a lot of almost natural harmony between extremely diverse sets of religious believers. The belief systems are very diverse, but they never thought we would have to wipe each other out. The reason for that, of course, is something very inherent in Hinduism, which is the truth is one, but the wise speak of it differently. This goes back all the way to the Vedas. Ekam sad vipra bahuda vadanti. So the wise are speaking about it differently. They're not unwise. They are wise, and they are expressing it in different ways. So all those must be wise ways. And it's something in the blood of all the Hindus. They don't need to know Sanskrit or the Vedas. It's a very common part of day-to-day life. Now, Hinduism, in a way, came to the West in an interfaith event. The World Parliament of Religions in 1893 was this massive interfaith event as part of the Columbian Exposition in Chicago. And Vivekananda was part of it. That's how he rose to prominence here in the West, and that was reflected back to India. So I think in our order, we have been closely connected to interfaith work ever since. it goes back before Vivekananda. I must mention Sri Ramakrishna,
Yes,
the
yes.
guru of Swami Vivekananda, who set him on this trajectory. One of his central teachings was the harmony of religions. He would say in Bengali, "Joto mat tato path," as many faiths, so many paths. So he saw the different religions as not as contending forces, but as different paths, all valid. They all work. They take you to the same divinity. So there's no need to fight, really. And it's really good that there are different paths. That makes it more glorious, more beautiful, more effective, actually. One more thing, just to complete the picture, what happened to thousands of years of Indian history was not just Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism, the three prominent religions of ancient times which survived down to today. They developed a common forum, a procedure of debate called Vada in Sanskrit. So highly qualified people, who would be masters of their own philosophies and of the opposing philosophies, they would engage in scholarly debate, something like a scholarly gladiatorial combat, trying to prove that they are right and trying to disprove the contentions of the opponents. And this is how philosophy developed. I don't think many were convinced either this way or that way. Debate really doesn't do that. But it leads to the development of philosophy. So Indian philosophy really flowered in, for example, 1,000 years of debate between Hinduism and Buddhism. Here are two religions. Hinduism believes in an immortal soul. Buddhism says there is no such thing. Hinduism believes in a God. Buddhism says there is no such thing. And then they have this 1,000-year debate. What it resulted in was a very sophisticated philosophical development. So this is how contentiousness was handled in ancient India.
Thank you for that. And I would add that in one of Vivekananda's famous speeches in Chicago in 1893, he hoped that the gathering would be the death knell of religious fanaticism. And it hasn't quite turned out that way, but maybe the ongoing efforts in the interfaith world will eventually succeed at that.
Right. I mean, I just want to, mention this. It's interesting, uncanny that when Vivekananda said this was 11th September, 1893,
yes.
9/11. And the 9/11, 2001, right here in New York, where I'm sitting, which was this devastating attack on New York by religiously inspired fanatics. So that continues to show, unfortunately, the relevance of what Vivekananda said more than 100 years ago. And even today, at the very beginning of the 21st century, it was marked by the fact that religion's intolerance is still a huge problem. And the message of interfaith harmony is hugely relevant today.
Thank you. One last question, if I may. I'm going to ask you something that was asked of me recently, and I'm not sure I answered it well. So I want to ask you, of all the precepts and concepts that have come to us through what we think of as Hinduism, the concept of karma has become widely familiar to people in the West and adopted, not just as a term or a language feature, but as a way of framing the events that occur to us in the world. And the question that most people, if they struggle with the concept of karma at all, it's usually around inexplicable events that seem to involve the suffering of innocent people, such as natural disasters, floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, etc., or the innocent bystanders who end up refugees or casualties in war zones. it seems cavalier to say, well, it was their karma and therefore rooted in past actions and so forth. How do you understand that? How do you explain such things in the light of karmic law, so to speak?
Yes. The law of karma, if you state it outright, but let me back up a little bit. I come across this again and again here in the West.
Yeah.
People struggling with the concept of karma, explain this to me, how does this work, why? And it's equally inexplicable to me why they struggle with it, because in India, nobody does. If there is one thing that's common to very diverse schools of Indian thought or philosophy, all schools of Hinduism accept karma in spite of their enormous internal diversity. All schools of Buddhism and Jainism and Sikhism, all schools of Indian thought, one thing that marks Indian thought is a kind of what Karl Popper calls presupposition of Indian philosophy, is karma, and then because of karma, reincarnation, multiple lives. Now, why would this be such a given non-issue? Because at least from my perspective and from the Indian perspective, a belief in causality is basically common sense. In fact, common sense and causality go together. Causes have effects, actions have consequences. This seems to be a no-brainer. So karma is just an extension of that basic idea, that if there is causality in the external natural world, is there causality in the moral world? Is there causality in the moral world? Is there a reason why bad things happen? Is there a reason why good things happen? Nobody really asks for a reason when good things happen, but we all want to know when bad things happen to us. And karma would say yes. If you ask why, there is an answer. The very question why implies cause and effect. You're asking for a cause of something that has happened. So that's it. Now, one need not interpret karma very, in a very hair-splitting way. This little an ant bit me. So is it that I crushed an ant somewhere in my past lives and now an ant has come and bitten me? Or well, you don't have to do that. The basic form in which karma is stated is, Vivekananda puts it very simply: good, good, bad, bad, and none escape the law. But whosoever wears a form wears the chain too. So the idea is that we are born with this body and this particular set of circumstances, these parents in this country and this kind of health, and this is an effect of something that must have happened in the past. I mean, in one sense, it's literally true, because science would say, yes, of course, it's an effect, and your parents and genetics and all of that. But in a more moral sense, that we are a sentient being, we have had past existences, and now we have this existence, and this existence has been conditioned by what we have done in the past. This is the basic idea of law of karma. If we have been deliberately mischievous, there will be unpleasant consequences in this life. We just don't remember, we just can't connect it. That's why it's not a natural law. A natural law, you can observe cause and effect together. That's why it's part of religion. There's a component of faith there. There must be some cause to this in the past. I think all human thought takes this into account. Even in the Bible, you see, as you sow, so shall you reap. It's just mediated through God's will and punishment and reward, from divine retribution and punishment that way. As far as the questions go, why should there be mass calamity? And who knows? Karma is not just a personal thing. You can't do a personal calculus. It's a community thing. If somebody dies, was it his fault? Not really. It's not a question of punishment and reward. It's more a question of causes set into motion in some distant, unknown past and giving rise to results now. People find it fascinating, this karma. The idea of karma is basically to make us more moral, make us better people. It's not to be cavalier and to say, oh, that's their karma, that's why they are suffering. They deserve it. That's a fatalistic way of interpreting karma. And I'm not saying that people have not done that. There's this story about when Swami Vivekananda went back to India from the West, a group of people they came to him for help, and they had organized a cow protection society. So Hindus, at least some of them, are big on cow protection. So Cow Protection Society, can you help us? And Vivekananda, came down on them like a ton of bricks. He says, in your part of the country, there is a famine and people are dying because of hunger. Are you doing something to, alleviate their suffering? And their answer was, oh, but that's their karma.
Ah.
Then Vivekananda was furious. He said, if that's their karma, then it's your karma to help them. It's your karma to help them. And they protested, but the cow is our mother. And Vivekananda was equally sarcastic, and he said, yeah, only a cow can give birth to such wonderful children. So that's a fatalistic way of interpreting the law of karma. Vivekananda's preferred way of interpreting the law of karma was that all that we are now is what we have built in the past, with all its good and bad, and how we react to the present is going to build a life for us in the years to come, which is pretty much common sense, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that. You've just given my ego a boost, because I once said exactly the same thing to somebody who said, well, it's their karma. And I said, well, it's your karma. Your karma will be based on what you do about
exactly
that person. So I feel like I've been validated. Thank you. It's also my good karma and a great blessing in my life to be able to have conversations like this with people like you. And I thank you for giving us the time today. And I'll look forward to seeing you in New York now that I live on the East Coast.
Absolutely, Phil. And keep doing this. This is blessed work. It's really, really very good karma.
Thank you very much. And listeners, thank you for listening to us. Please subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss a show. Tell your friends about it, and email me with suggestions, especially if you have any people to recommend that we interview. And check out my events and on my website, and if you'd like, subscribe to my mailing list. And we'll see you next time with another wise and wonderful guest. Thank you again, Swami.
Thank you, Phil.